Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the afternoon session of the Health and Life Science Conference. And as you all know, we're trying to look into a couple of subject matters which might help change the prescription for patients in the future, the prescription for healthcare. And what we're trying to uncover is what's going on in innovation, what's going on with patient engagement or consumerism, as we heard this morning, and what's going on in terms of transparency. And we can look at each of these subject matters, and I think you've all got your own interpretation of what they mean and questions that you might have that you want to put to the panel that I'll introduce to you in a moment. But I think as far as innovation is concerned, it's not just making products, right? It's the processes. It's how we think about drugs. It's how we think about medical devices. It's how we think about the combination of those things. It's how we deliver those. It's the business model. It's how do we make money out of it. It's how do we make sure people are getting value for money. And for patient engagement or consumerism, the world is changing, and it's changing really fast. And just to give you a sense of that, 10 years ago, the pharma industry only concentrated on the physician, except for one or two exceptions. And we have a company here today that's going to talk about one of those exceptions, which has really blown into a new way of thinking about pharmaceuticals. Patient engagement means different things to you too, because you're potentially all patients at some point, if not today. And how do you want to engage? Who do you want to engage with? How should the pharmaceutical companies and the biotech companies and the med device companies be interacting with you? What do you expect of them? What would you like to say to them? You get a chance today to say that. So make sure you use that time. And what about transparency? What is transparency? What's this 15-year thing you keep hearing about for regards to drugs? Do you all know what that is? What's involved? Do you? You're allowed to answer. Who knows what goes on in the 15 years to bring a new drug to market? Where's my class? Right, thank you. Okay. So my name is Phillip. And I teach strategy in pharmaceuticals and biotech and a bunch of other things. And so my class knows what goes into 15 years of development, right? But do you? And what are these clinical trials that go on? That go on for so many years and consume so many dollars, which the FDA wants to see. Do you understand what's going on there? We'll hear about that today too. And what about pricing? Let's talk about a certain hedge fund manager, Shire, and Turing Pharmaceuticals, and what a joy this summer. This has created such a whirlwind. Maybe we should talk about that. And Baglin, what do they do? And what about pricing in general? It's scary, isn't it? And do you want to know more? So today, I think, is a chance to understand a little deeper from our panel what's going on with each of their companies and how they think about it. And although they're going to speak to you a little bit for a few minutes, they want to hear from you, what your questions are, and to address them. So right now I'm going to ask you if there's any burning questions that they should cover as they go through their discussion with you. Any burning questions? Raise your hand. Yes. What's your burning question?
I'm very much interested in how one might justify and argue for doing particularly risky research and what sort of movements need to be made in order to approve for that 15 years of development for something that is incredibly risky and whether or not that ever comes into play.
Right. So why would you invest money in something that's going to take 15 years, particularly if it's high risk? Yeah? Okay.
Current communications and nature of relationships between biotech, pharma, and academia, where a lot of the research publications are. Right? That's always been a.
How do they interact?
How do they interact, or how are they seeing that relationship develop over the years? Especially now, publication is a really important process for academia.
Sure.
However, not so much for
Sure. Okay.
industry.
I think we can cover that too. Great. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to have each of the 4 panelists come up and speak for 5 minutes. We've got some slides with the first person, but then the others will just talk and basically open it up for questions with each person so that you get a chance to ask them specifically what they're doing and how they're addressing these issues. And then if we've got time at the end, we'll get the whole panel together to address any broader questions as well. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce everyone here, and then we'll ask our first speaker to come up. So first we have Erika, Gill, who's with us from Biogen and comes with a very interesting background. She's been director of commercial operations, director of franchise marketing, nursing operations, senior director now, and doing a lot of reimbursement work in her past, and clearly is an MBA student from here, so she must be incredibly good. So we welcome Erika. Erika, thank you. And Safia, Rizvi, who's here today, although she has an organic chemistry background, has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a number of years at GSK, and then went to India to work for 4 years with UCB and a couple of other companies. Is now back here doing a startup herself, and is going to give us the Indian perspective on what innovation means today. And then we have Jeff Pfefferkorn, who's a PhD at Pfizer. He's the executive director of Pfizer's cardiovascular, metabolic, and endocrine disease research unit in Cambridge. And he's going to talk to us about innovation. He's going to talk to us about some of the ways they're thinking about patient engagement, as well as transparency as well. I think they're all going to try and hit on these subjects, so with a bit of luck we'll get an overview of that. And finally, Mark Baglin, who's with Shire, Vice President of Product Strategy Team Leader for the angioedema franchise. And again, many years in the industry on the marketing and business side of things, and really driving forward with this rare disease area that Shire's really taken the mantle from Genzyme and really run with it to the next level. And we'll learn from him a lot about what they're doing with patients and how they're starting to integrate that within their business, because it makes so much sense. So I think you're going to hear a lot of interesting stories today. So get ready with your questions. I'm going to ask Mark to come up and kick us off. He's got a few slides he wants to share with us to get us going.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hi. Probably spot a theme here because my name's Mark and I have a weird accent also, so by coincidence. So yeah, I'm going to talk for probably about 10 minutes. I'm going to talk probably in 2 areas, hopefully, that will be of interest to you. Firstly, from the development side, I think, sorry, what was your name? The question about risky development?
Brennan.
Brennan's question is a really good one because I'm going to deal with that first. I'm going to talk a little bit about why a company would even bother getting into a high-risk, potentially low-return area, and rare diseases is the quintessence of that in some ways. And then secondly, I'm going to sort of segue to this question of the patient and how the patient really is the centre of everything that we do in our rare disease company, and I'm pretty sure that's the case in other rare disease companies too. The patient really sits right in the centre of everything. That's a real paradigm shift for anyone that's worked in the pharmaceutical industry, especially outside of the US, where everything's about the doctor, very much sort of paternalistic medicine. It's different now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's different. So keep it informal. I've got some slides. I won't go through every word on every slide. Stop me if you've got questions, okay? Great. So provocative. We were asked, come with a provocative question. But here's a provocative question for you. Why would a pharmaceutical company spend a minimum of $800 million, that's a very low investment, by the way, to develop a novel treatment for a disease with a few hundred sufferers? Okay, why would a company do that? Well, Let me tell you a quick story. All right, so not a story actually, paint a picture. Imagine you're sitting there right now listening to this guy with a weird accent, okay? And all of a sudden you feel kind of a twinge in your abdomen, like a sort of small stomachache. What's going on? That stomachache gets worse and worse and worse, over about 45 minutes to an hour. And what's happening is your insides are swelling. Okay, your gut is swelling, and it's causing a huge amount of pressure inside your abdomen. Okay, it's swelling. Where can it go? You've got nowhere to go. And at some point, you're vomiting, you have diarrhea, you have no idea what's going on. Okay, you don't know what to do, so you go to the emergency room. What are they doing in an emergency room? They open you up. Okay, they look for the grumbling appendix. They look for the gallbladder that's not working right. If for a female, they may give you a hysterectomy, God forbid. It happens all the time in people with hereditary angioedema. Hereditary angioedema is a genetic disease. About 1 in 40,000 people in the US, so about 7,000 people have this disease. And until a few years ago, there was no treatment for hereditary angioedema. And that swelling can happen anywhere in the body. It can happen in your abdomen, and women have told me that it's more painful than childbirth. It's more painful than having a baby when you have one of these abdominal attacks. And you can have 3 a month. And what's worse is it can take 13 years for the doctors to figure out what the heck's going on with this swell. So this is a life-changing disease. It can happen anywhere in the body. It can happen in your hand. Your hand can swell like a baseball pin. Your foot can swell so much that you can't get your shoe on. You can have your abdomen swell. Worst of all, it could be in your larynx. And if you get a laryngeal swell, which everyone will have at some point with this disease, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you'll die from that laryngeal swell. It's not a trivial disease, okay, hereditary angioedema. So, first answer, why would a pharmaceutical company spend that much money? Because of these rare diseases, it's the right thing to do. Okay, and I'm going to expand on that now. So, rare diseases. There are lots of them. There are 7,000 rare diseases currently characterized. Okay? And the definition in the US of a rare disease, it does differ around the world, is any disease with less than 200,000 sufferers in the US. So hereditary angioedema with 7,000 sufferers, that makes it an ultra disease, very, very rare disease. Okay? But if you look in the US, if you add up all the people who have a rare disease, it's about 30 million people, which is about 10% of the population, give or take. So they're rare, but in their entirety, they're not that rare. Okay? 30% of children who have rare diseases do not live past their 5th birthday. So they're tragic. They cause tragedies in people's lives. And 95% of rare diseases do not have an FDA-approved treatment. So rare diseases are areas of huge unmet needs. Huge unmet needs. Now, companies are developing lots and lots of drugs. There are about 400 rare disease treatments that have been approved, and about another 450, this is back in 13, which is the last data I could find, about another 450 rare diseases drugs in treatment, but still only about 5% of rare diseases have an effective drug treatment for it. So again, huge area of unmet need. Many companies, particularly here in Cambridge, are working really hard to try and find cures for these diseases, or at least treatments. So again, if you've got some knowledge of what it takes to bring a drug to market, this is different. It's not the same as bringing another, not that cancer drugs aren't important, they're really important, or a rheumatoid arthritis drug, but the track to approval for rare disease drugs is different. Why is that? Well, first off, it may well be that there's no clear understanding of the disease. There's probably not been a clinical trial done in this disease before, so you've no idea what the end point of the study is. What are you aiming at? What are you trying to show? There's never been a regulatory path trodden before, so this is the first time anyone's been to the FDA to ask for an approval for a drug in this disease. Okay? They're rare patients. Where are they? How do you find them? You've got to find the patients to do your clinical studies. Okay? Payers. Frankly, insurance companies hate rare diseases because they're expensive. They are expensive per patient. Now, in terms of their overall cost to business, drop it in the ocean, drop it in the bucket, but the cost per patient is quite high. There's a lot of need for education. Quite often, there's a lot of pressure for early access. So we know there's a clinical study being done in this disease. My kid's got this disease. I want into that clinical study. The pressure is huge to get onto these drugs. Very expensive to manufacture quite often. And so overall, that makes the commercial justification quite challenging for people like me who want to bring these drugs into development. From an R&D perspective, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but you probably know that to bring a small molecule to the market, you need 2 adequately powered phase 3 studies, double-blind, placebo-controlled, big, big, big and expensive. And you also, in Europe, need benefit to a comparator. Well, for a rare disease, this is really difficult to do because there aren't that many patients. You don't know what you're aiming at from an endpoint perspective. There might not be many investigators out there. Very little scientific literature to compare to. What do you compare to? And is it ethical to use placebo in studies? That's all challenging for rare diseases. And just to really develop that a little further, often when you do rare disease studies, it means you're actually discovering the epidemiology. Nobody knows what the natural history is of this rare disease. So if you don't know the natural history, how do you power a clinical study to show that it will change again? It's a real challenge. So quite often you have to actually commit to doing natural history studies alongside your clinical studies in parallel. Build the plane while you're flying it. That can be really challenging too. The time and cost of this can be high, and it goes back to this question of risk, because if the drug fails, all this money goes down the drain. Okay. Few patients may mean many centres, so powering is a challenge, obviously. So the bottom line here in this section is that rare disease studies are not cheap or easy. Okay? It's a real challenge for an R&D company to do rare disease studies. Okay, as we said, uncertainty about mechanisms, lack of preclinical models, not knowing what the target is, the biomarker is. Clinical trial path not yet well defined, and therefore there's a huge commitment of time, money, and people. Throw the dice to try and bring one of these rare disease drugs to market. Okay, that's why these drugs are expensive to develop. Switching gears, commercialization. So let's imagine you've been through all those haystacks and you found that needle, and you managed to bring the drug through to regulatory approval. What next? Well, on the left, what you see is kind of the traditional pharma marketing model where sales and marketing influence doctors, many thousands of them, primary care physicians maybe. Okay, they write a prescription which the payer reimburses and the patient gets the drug and it just keeps going around in circles. It's a very simple model that the pharmaceutical industry has been doing for years. The rare disease model is very different, like I said. So at the top end of the cascade, fairly simple. Okay, sales, marketing, prescribers, maybe only a few hundred prescribers or tens of prescribers, but similar there. But the relationship between the patient and the prescriber in a rare disease is often very different. It's much more of a partnership as opposed to that kind of paternalistic, I'm the doctor, I know best. And in Europe, unfortunately, it still is a bit like that, even in the rare disease space. But here it's much more of a partnership. Okay? So once that patient gets on the drug, then a whole series of resources get brought to bear on that patient to support them. The payers themselves, the specialty pharmacies who supply the drugs when a prescription is written, they have patient services people who reach out to the patients and provide support. Family members are really involved with these rare diseases. But over here you've got what the pharmaceutical company can do, and that's the patient services organisations that we have. I'll talk more about those in a minute. And then there's patient advocacy organisations, very organised, very mobilised in this space, politically very savvy, a lot of these organisations. And then just other patients, networks. So, what is a rare diseaseologist? There is no such thing as a rare diseaseologist, right? There's no such thing. So any of these rare diseases can take years to actually get diagnosed because there's no single specialty dealing with rare diseases. So for hereditary angioedema, for example, like I said, you go to the emergency room, you get opened up, they don't find anything wrong. So you go home, you have another attack, you come back again, you get opened up again. I've seen a photo of an 18-year-old German girl, okay, who has HAE, with 4 incisions, appendix, gallbladder. They were going to give her a hysterectomy, but thank God somebody found out that she actually had this disease and treated her appropriately. So a lot of unnecessary surgery. But for this particular disorder called mucopolysaccharidosis, MPS, Huntington's disease, affects boys, all of these specialists here could be involved in diagnosing and treating that patient. So that makes our job as marketers really difficult because you have to, again, look for more needles in haystacks here. Challenging. So as a marketer, you've got to know your market, and each population is different. So an HAE population is different from an MPS population, okay? And it's as much about joining a community as it is about marketing to a consumer because you're opting into this network, okay? So you've got to add value, all right? And that means providing access and reimbursement support. I'll talk more about that in the Q&A session, as well as education resources. Again, like I said, I'll skip through this slide. But this is about customer intimacy, particularly about being intimate, knowing, working with the patient. Customer intimacy. Pricing. Okay. So orphan drugs improve lives. I think you know that, otherwise the drugs wouldn't get to market. But you've already invested $800 million to $2 billion up front to bring it to market. You need to make a return on your investment. Okay? And that's where pricing gets controversial, but where it's really important that we're able to charge appropriate prices for rare disease drugs to generate the return so that we can still develop more drugs for rare diseases. We've got 27 rare disease programs in the clinic, early clinic, and in the lab at this point. They'll have to be paid for. So there's obviously that whole point of keeping the R&D cycle funded. But the bottom line is that decisions on appropriate treatment often remain a negotiation between the patient, the physician, and the payer. So, summarising, I think I've made the point. Rare diseases are different. Rare diseases are not like small molecule pharmaceuticals. There are many more factors at play in developing and supporting rare diseases. And hopefully what I've done today is actually stimulated some thoughts with you, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you. I apologize, I was speaking quickly.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. One question I have is about the cost of clinical trials, to understand a little bit more. Because on one hand, as you pointed out, there are a lot of challenges in conducting clinical trials in rare diseases. On the other hand, there are opportunities for savings because fewer patients, so there's a certain cost per patient in the clinical trial. So doing a 50-patient trial is cheaper compared to 1,000 patient. Then you could have opportunities for accelerated approval based on phase 2 only instead of phase 3. There's FDA gives like a 7-year market exclusivity for orphan drugs. So there are a lot of those potential incentives and things that could make clinical development cheaper for rare diseases.
So the incentives are there because if the incentives weren't there, not many companies would even do this in the first place. So again, there's a relationship between the rareness of the disease and the incentives needed to bring the drugs to market. But don't assume that because there are fewer patients, the studies are cheaper to run. You've got to find them, you've got to find the centres, you've got to support the centres, you've got to manufacture the clinical trial drug, often at really high cost because you're setting up entire manufacturing facilities for the clinical trial drug alone. With no certainty that at the end of the day you're going to be able to commercialise that drug. So, I think, well, I've said it's not necessarily cheaper.
It's still the biggest chunk of the 800 million that you see up there. And that's for a successful drug, because if they're unsuccessful, you throw the money away.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Thanks for coming. You spoke about FDA regulations not being fully defined about how to bring these drugs to market, and I was wondering about how you go about working with a relationship with the FDA to help define the guidance for such drugs.
Exactly. So there are milestones, sort of mileposts along the way where you actually consult with the FDA. So before you move into phase 1, end of phase 1, end of phase 2, end of phase 3, you actually consult with the FDA. And then immediately, hopefully prior to getting the approval, there's also what they call the FDA advisory panel, which will be a panel of experts that come together to consider the drug. Often there are speakers from the floor, patients in many cases, will lobby the advisors. The advisors will give a recommendation to the FDA whether a drug should or should not be approved. That's all very influential. So there are lots of opportunities to consult with the FDA.
In a rare disease where you don't know kind of the etiology of disease, how do you figure out what the endpoint is, and how do you get the FDA to agree that the endpoint really is legitimate?
It's a process of consultation. So where there are experts who know about the disorder, you will bring those guys together to help you in an internal advisory board to define what the biomarker is or what the objective of the study would be, which you then take to the FDA and say, we've consulted with the experts, this is what we're recommending, do you buy into that? It's not foolproof. Yeah.
You mentioned the alarming statistics of children not living to the age of 5. How does the process begin to even think of a clinical trial involving children or any kind of research involving the production of a drug that could save these children? But
it's one of the most ethically challenging things that we do is to run clinical trials for kids, but you have to take a long view. At the end of the day, there are kids that probably haven't yet been born who will benefit from the results of the study that you're doing, but it's tough.
Among the thousands of these rare diseases, how do you specify which one to target? Is it based on the amount of patients affected by it, or the R&D costs? Or?
Often it's a great question. So we deal with this all, and I think you probably deal with this all the time doing what you do in the discovery area, but often it's what do we know about the disease, what do we know about the pathophysiology of the disease, and can we even think of a way of treating this? Could we design a drug that could affect this? But it is, well, I think you're going to talk about it, so.
It's typically the science. It's exactly what you said. When the science breaks, that's when you go after it.
So just a follow-up on what is the least known drug or the least known disease that we don't know about? Is that the scariest thing to target? Or?
I don't think I'm going to answer that question. It depends if we know anything about it. What can we find out about it?
Sometimes it's serendipitously you're doing research on something else, and then you learn that while somebody's on the trial, they get better on the rare disease, and then we follow up.
I think this is where the universities come in. A lot of great ideas and breakthroughs come out of the universities, and those relationships you were asking about become really powerful in terms of instructing you where you might have an impact or what you might be able to do. So it's not just research that's going on in the pharma companies, because now it's about what's going on in the world. Let's try and pull that in. The bigger companies can actually access that quite easily. Smaller companies have a harder time, but that's where it's at, and it's happening everywhere. So there's breakthroughs all the time. And so what might be the most difficult thing today may change tomorrow. And it's all about how that science is playing out. So Mark, I'm going to say thank you for that, and we'll bring up our next speaker. Gill from Biogen, and take it away.
So all of us have life experiences that help shape us. And for me, my life experiences have helped shape my career and where I work today. So at 3 years old, my mother enrolled me in, I think what we would call today an inclusion school. So my classmates, my friends were kids who were in strollers and had leg braces and couldn't speak. And so when they were getting OT, I was laying on the mats with them and rolling around. And so this was my first experience. I don't know if many people have ever heard about Anne Sullivan, who was the teacher of Helen Keller. And so that was the school that I actually started in at 3 years old. And I grew up with my mother taking care of everybody in our family who was sick. And they lived in our house at different points in time. And as I got my license, I was responsible for driving my aunt to dialysis and sitting with her in the hospital when my mother needed a break. And I was very fortunate because although my mother has a high school degree and had a very great career, somehow she was super smart when it came to healthcare. Because I think she's badass. Like, she just advocates. And I admire that so much. And I'm very grateful because she's so good and she continues to do that for people in our family. So that led me into healthcare. And so I started my career at Brigham and Women's Hospital down the street as an administrator. And then we joke that I joined the dark side and went to Genzyme and then to Biogen. In my career, what I love is really helping patients. And so my favorite jobs have been when I know that we're making a difference. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. All of us who participate in healthcare are supposed to be doing. So I've worked in service programs. You know, Mark talked about how incredibly important these are for patients. And it's a weird thing if you think about biotech being involved directly with patients, right? We're not the healthcare provider, but patients need additional support. And we know that these products are very difficult, very complicated. And so one of my favorite jobs, which was my previous job to the one I have now, I was responsible for a nurse educator team. And this was an amazing opportunity to go out and actually see how your product, this product that just went through this huge development phase, meets the patient. And you know what? These are complicated drugs that cost a lot of money, that may be difficult for a patient to administer, and how do you help them do that? Because you know what? In a clinic visit, a doctor doesn't have time to teach them about this. And a nurse is mostly on the telephone with patients talking about side effects when an issue comes up. And so we had the chance to put together a really strong nursing team to go out and actually be in patients' home. And it was a privilege to be in their home. Because we got to sit there when they came face to face with their disease and teach them about what this product can do, what the side effects are, and how to administer it, and work with their families. And it was also an interesting opportunity because, you know, I have an MBA, I've done some marketing, but I wouldn't say I'm a marketer. And as much as like we would sit in-house and think of, oh, patients need all of this stuff, when you came into that interaction and you saw the pile of things that we had build for patient education, we thought we had figured it out. But when you're in that moment, you see all of this converge, this time when the patient's actually taking your product. You see what works and what doesn't. And so you hear this buzz now about people talking about patient centricity, right? We need to be close to our patients. We need to do market research. We need to talk to them. But until you're in their shoes, until you go through that experience with them, and then you continue to do that, you miss out. And we know great companies who think about their customers all the time. I mean, we could raise our hands now about amazing service. I will die with an American Express card in my pocket because I love American Express. Because anybody who answers the call knows me, can take care of everything with a smile. Well, we also have that opportunity in a biotech situation too, that we can help patients and we can offer really great services to help them. So what else are we doing besides offering these awesome services? So I joked with Mark, I was doing a little homework, so I called around to some of my friends at Biogen. So obviously we make great drugs, but we're trying to do some things differently. So Matt has our heads up a new team over the last couple of years that was built, which is called the Patient Center of Excellence, right? Patient centricity. So I asked Matt, I said, tell me what you're doing differently with this team than what we used to do. And he said, nothing starts without talking to the patient first. He goes, no one's allowed to sit in a room and come up with ideas and just read market research and come out with an idea. That we have to be engaged with patients all the time. The other is that it's obvious, but we as consumers, us as patients, we want information that's unbranded. We don't want all the drug names all over everything. We want information that's not just going to help me about this drug, but help me in this lifestyle, help me with this disease that I'm facing. And so Matt's team has been really working on new content. And this thing around transparency is that patients don't understand why, first of all, we have to tell them all the safety information. They don't understand what goes into a clinical trial. They don't understand the challenges that happen with their insurance. And so he's even helping to produce content in this area to help create transparency of the relationship that we as Biogen have with patients. And I would face this with our nurse educators going out to the home. They would say, oh, well, you're a nurse, well, you can advise me. Well, no, we're here to provide you healthcare information, but I'm not your nurse. I can't advise you. I'm not allowed to advise you. You need to speak to your physician. And again, like they don't understand that. Well, why can't you tell me? Well, I don't know your medical history. You and your doctor have decided to take this medication. And so it's this, we have to be very clear around what our role is in their care and in providing that education. Another great area that my friend Kendra Buzzle is working on is value-based medicine. So when we talk about like the shift in the healthcare environment, you know, we today are around pay-for-performance, but the payers are actually helping to start thinking about and pushing us to think about pay-for-outcomes. Well, we just talked about this with trials. Like, well, what are the outcomes that we're looking for, and how do you actually measure them? And what you do in a clinical trial is very different than real world in a clinic. These clinical trials where, you know, you have a long patient visit, we're going to fill out all these forms, you're going to be in there for a visit for a couple hours. It's not going to make sense when you have a 15-minute time that you have to be in front of your physician. So the team is trying to be really innovative, think about disruptive technology, and think about how can they create these tools that truly, first define what the outcomes need to be and do it in a very relevant way for physicians in the clinic. And so the teams are thinking through that right now and testing that. And obviously, this is one where physicians are heavily involved, but also patients will be involved because patients will have the opportunity to complete these questionnaires or participate to provide their healthcare information that gets over to their physician. So really cool, different ways than the obvious that we're just, you know, creating drugs. So I know I started off kind of talking about Anne Sullivan, and I just wanted to share a quote that I found from her. So a little bit more, I don't know why I was like being a little like thinking about childhood, how fun it is. I have a 3-year-old now. Did her parent-teacher conference today. I mean, it is awesome being in that classroom. Very different than this, right? A lot of fun. But I was thinking, she's a pretty incredible woman. So here's a woman who herself had lost a ton of vision. Her parents had put her into the Perkins School of Blind. And she actually came out and became a teacher. So you think about that alone and the adversity that she had in her life to even graduate as a woman at that time. And then also to have, to be blind. And so she came out to be this extraordinary teacher. And when she was valedictorian of a class, and what she said in her speech I thought was awesome. It said, "Duty bids us go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, earnestly, and set ourselves to find our special part. And when we found it, willingly and faithfully perform it." And I thought that was just awesome, because she lived her life that way. So for 50 years, she took care of someone who was deaf and blind and taught her how to better life. And I think that's what this is about. This is about us helping people to have a better life, because as Mark said, it's not just these patients. Well, guess who these patients are? They're the people we love, they're our friends, and it will be us. So I guess the question is, what are we going to do about it?
So questions for Erika?
Or any of these guys, because they can answer all the time.
So you said that you make sure that before you do a marketing plan that you have those in the room meet with patients. How do you get that to that kind of communication to permeate through the rest of the company, with the scientists and the technicians, I guess, and everybody else? How do they get that patient-centric focus?
Yes, it's a great question. So one is, it has to be a part of your culture, and I think that our CEO is amazing, and he's so focused about the patient. Everything we do in the company is focused on the patient. But I do think, we have a very big organization, so you're right, how do we get people outside of just, because that's mostly done in the commercial realm. But I think what we're finding is, especially where R&D has to design clinical trials, there's different ways that through, we have some cross-functional teams where we're trying to pepper in that information as well. And I think that you're seeing, it's neat, you're seeing this stuff not just happen kind of in the commercial where we're selling the drug, but it's coming further back in the pipeline and even into manufacturing, believe it or not. So our head of manufacturing had a chance to even ride with the nurse out into the home and went and saw how the auto injector that they had designed, how it was actually playing out. And so I think it's one, making sure that your senior level leaders are also very involved, but you have mechanisms within your organization to share that. But I think it is a challenge.
So my question is about, so there's a lot of companies that are really doing a lot for patient-assistance programs and really helping the patient as some of the stuff that you described. But one of the things I was thinking about is, is there ever a risk of, almost doing too much and being with this patient and really helping him or her, but then really the patient is just sticking with that company and might not be considering another product from a different company, and kind of where to draw the line in terms of that, and how to prevent conflicts of interest.
So I can only really speak about MS, that I know that's space, but maybe you guys want to pipe in as well. In MS, there's just common services that everybody's going to provide around copay assistance and things like that. I don't think that any of that blocks the patient in, if you will, to keeping them so loyal that they're not. And I think that, to be honest, our job is to help patients, period. So whether they're on our drug or not, and that's one of the things that Matt was talking to me about as well. It's he wants to provide the best information out for MS patients, whether you're ours or not, because he believes at the end of the day that's going to help patients. So I think it depends on how the company wants to interact with that patient community, but I think we still feel very strongly that that relationship is first owned between the patient and the physician, and we're there to help support, but it is never to interrupt that.
I'll give two answers. Answer 1A says we're very heavily regulated anyway, so there are things that you can't do. You just can't do that would be too much. So that's answer 1A, and that really, I think, supports what you just said. Answer 1B is I am a marketer, and I want them to put more to my company, and I want them to stay with us. I don't see that as a problem, as long as it's done right.
A question, I think this goes for primarily on the social marketing side of things. I mean, we've seen already how much social marketing really moves treatments and support for some of these diseases. I mean, a perfect case scenario is the Sam Burns with progeria and that whole advocacy I mean, it's a disease that nobody knew anything about, but yet they were able to get stuff onto clinical trials within just a short period of time. And what you're talking about is sad for children. But again, look at something like the ALS movement and stuff. These are things that actually, when you get the community and people aware about it, it really moves the support and systems for it. I mean, where does you see the role in pharma and biotech that they can serve to propose much more of this effort to help some of the social movements behind it? I think already once the people and patients, general public know, really emotionally feel that impact, it's amazing what happens.
Again, I'll throw it out to anybody. I'm not as close to this, but I still think that we're, as an industry, it's still very difficult for us to really truly participate in social media because of the regulations that we have. And again, Matt and I were talking about this morning. He's like, even if we take a little step, it's still better than we are right now, but we're not nimble in that space at all, just because of the regulatory requirements. And I mean, it's one thing if you're just kind of putting a marketing campaign and you're just putting something out there, but if you truly want to have a level of interaction, there's associated risk with that, where there could be someone talks about a product complaint or an adverse event in the social media. We have an obligation as a company to report that and to manage that. And so it's not so much that it's being said out there, it's just that we have an obligation to deal with that. So, and then obviously, how we communicate about products has to be very balanced. So that's not really, something you can put in a text or whatever. I mean, it just doesn't work well that way. So I think we have a lot to do.
A great example of where pharma works very closely with the outside world is with patient advocacy groups. It's the Vertex example, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the development of a number of drugs that they've made in that space is a great example of where engaging with those that really care about this condition can drive something very quickly. So there's an element that one can absolutely tap into, and a level of expertise which comes along with that, which is tremendous.
You might be able to partner more with companies like Patients Like Me and things where you're working through them. And some of these companies have been really innovative to say, we recognize you guys have these requirements, so we're going to help try to manage some of that for you or give you reports back out of that maybe you'll need to have for your regulatory responsibilities.
So Erika, thank you very much. Jeff to come up here and give us his thoughts on how Pfizer's approaching it.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity. So as Mark said in his introduction, I actually work in the cardiovascular and metabolic disease space. So we actually, in quite contrast to the rare disease space, we treat conditions like obesity, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, heart failure, conditions that actually affect a very large number of patients. And if you look at leading causes of death, actually are many of the leading causes of death in developed worlds. But interestingly, so you would say, well, we have a lot of patients, it makes it easier, but it doesn't. We actually face different and unique challenges, and I thought I would share a couple of examples of those with you, because I think it nicely illustrates how, as Mark said, if you think 10 years ago, we were focused on the prescriber and helping the prescriber to understand what we were developing and value the patient. Now, we have a lot more stakeholders. The prescriber is still a stakeholder, but we have to think about the value proposition to the payer and the value proposition to the patient. And so let me give you two examples. So one area that we work in is liver disease. So you probably, most of you might have heard about diseases like NASH, non-alcoholic hepatic steatosis, which it's a disease that actually, it's a very progressive disease that probably occurs over a 20 to 30 year time frame. Generally, it starts out with people accumulating fat in their liver. It's sort of an accumulation of metabolic syndrome in the liver. So diet, insulin resistance, lack of physical activity leads to the accumulation of fat in the liver over time. And just to put perspective around that, in the US, it's estimated that about 50 million people have this condition of fatty liver. So some of you today may already have this condition. A subset of that 50 million, let's say 10 to 15%, then progress on to a condition known as NASH, or non-alcoholic hepatic steatosis, where the fat in the liver causes inflammation. That inflammation begins to cause necrosis and ultimately fibrosis and cross-linking and collagen deposition. And then a portion of those patients, say 5 to 10%, progress on to a condition like cirrhosis and ultimately will need liver transplant. So it's obviously, for those patients that progress the entire continuum, it's a very severe medical event and equally very expensive. The challenge is, as we develop a drug, for example, to treat the early stages of the disease. So I think in many of the diseases we treat, whether it's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, liver disease, it may be easier to treat the disease in the earlier stages, essentially to correct the driver of the disease rather than trying to address the severe metabolic or physiologic consequence later. But if you think about addressing the disease early, which makes sort of common sense from a scientific perspective, the problem you very quickly run up against is that the numbers of patients is very large, right? And from a payer's perspective, that makes payers very nervous. So what the payer says is, well, if you have a drug that will treat fatty liver disease, I don't want you treating 50 million patients, right? That's too expensive. And if only a small subset, say 10-15% of those patients progress, then it's not good value for money to treat the 50 million. We have to figure out a way to subset those patients to understand which of the 50 million are at the highest risk of progressing and ultimately will become the most expensive and medically critical patients. So a lot of the things we think about in the cardiovascular metabolic space now are sort of patient stratification. In other words, how do you pick out that 10 to 15%? It could be based on genetics. If we understand certain variants will lead to risk of progression. It could be circulating biomarkers that we can measure. And, we develop a diagnostic test that would allow identifying those at highest risk for progression. So you see this a lot because I think that way you can go to the payer and you can make a very reasonable value proposition to them. Another area, heart failure, that we work on. So it's a large disease, but it's an extremely heterogeneous disease. So two major classifications, preserved and reduced ejection fraction. But even within those, there's like 20 different really forms of the disease. And a lot of times we develop medicines, they'll only work in a certain pathophysiology within that disease. So again, we have to find ways to identify those patients, both from a patient value perspective, a payer value perspective, but equally from a clinical trial perspective. Because if you have a mechanism that really is only going to benefit 10% of the patients based on the disease pathophysiology that they have, and then you run a large trial where you include a broad population, your drug may actually work and you may get a robust efficacy signal, but it may actually be then drowned out by the fact that 80 or 90% didn't have the right biology to respond in the first place, and if you weren't able to identify them, you sort of lose the effect of your drug. So in both cases, either to identify progression or to stratify based on disease pathology, it's a real challenge, I think, for us right now in the cardiovascular metabolic space. I think the other comment I would make from a patient perspective, similar to the comments you just heard, is that our perspective is also changing significantly, much more patient-centric. So yesterday, for example, we just had a large patient ad board on lupus to really understand these complicated diseases and not only what the registration endpoint might be, but what do the patients experience on a day-to-day basis? What is actually important to the patient? Because what's important to the patient may not be the same thing that's important to the regulator. The regulator may care about some abstract composite score, which we'll have to address, but equally what the patient cares about is, am I fatigued? Activities of daily living, can I play with my kids? Can I go to work? And so it's trying to understand what's most important to the patient so that when we do run our clinical trials, in addition to getting the regulatory endpoints that will allow us to get the drug registered into patients, we collect quality of life and different patient-reported outcomes to understand how it's affecting their quality of life. And I think, we live in a very exciting time right now with digital health, all the mobile devices, all these different types of sensors that it used to be historically you would do some type of checklist of quality of life of the patient. But now you can do literally remote monitoring, you can use iPhones, there's all kinds of technology available to really capture that patient experience and then integrate that into the overall value proposition of the drug. So maybe with that, I'll pause. I'm happy to take any questions. Questions?
So earlier today, Aaron Oppenheimer talked about Daktari and how the World Health Organization, he had a device that would be able to test the strength of an immune system for a relatively easy test, simple flow cytometry in a small device. And eventually, WHO came out and said, oh, that's not necessary. We're only looking to treat HIV patients that are in the severest stage. So similar to the problem that you were dealing with the fatty liver disease and sort of that metabolic process, where you have payers telling you that you shouldn't necessarily invest in that research because of how large of a problem it is, how does that divert or direct the movements that a pharmaceutical company might make? And has that led to projects being stopped before?
It has. I mean, what you say is it's a significant challenge, right? The payer cares about you curing the most severe patient, but a lot of times the science doesn't actually overlap with that. That by the time they've gotten to that stage of disease progression, you may not even be able to arrest the pathologic process, right? And certainly you probably can't reverse it. So for the sake of patient benefit, it would have been much better had you started early. Right, and I think that's where the whole value proposition comes in. And, the problem is, over the course of 20 years, that individual patient, he might be covered by 5 different insurance companies. So the insurance company that covers him very early in the process, just being very economic about it, are they worried about, the potential cost that he would pose to the system much later? I think we those are all challenges. In the perfect world, if the science lets you go after the latest stage, most aggressive part of the disease, then that's an absolute win. But in many cases, the science says you actually have to intervene early, and that's where we have to try to get the economics to work.
Thank you.
How do you make judgment calls about, in kind of particularly the endocrine space, about like drugs to treat obesity? I mean, how do you kind of walk that line between medically managing something and kind of changing lifestyle factors, which may or may not be effective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, actually. And we discuss this a lot because I think in obesity, as an example, there's a recognition that pharmacotherapy alone is probably not going to be effective, that it needs to be sort of part of an overall sort of weight management approach, and that would include physical activity, it might include dietary counseling. And so I think what you're seeing is as companies are trying to go back into the obesity space, and I think it is important to go into the obesity space. It's certainly a disease, right? It has lifestyle components, but it's certainly a disease, and it's a disease that drives a lot of risk factor for other diseases, whether it be diabetes or cardiovascular disease. But we and others in this space definitely taking a holistic approach that, in addition to the medicine, here's counseling around diet, here's motivation around physical activity. So you're exactly right.
With such a high prevalence of these non-communicable diseases, how do you prevent an overgeneralization? So I understand not focusing on just the most severe, most specific cases, but with so many people trying to catch these early on and dealing with them to lessen the effects later, how can you avoid making an overgeneralization and not focusing on the specific personalized care of the patient?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? I mean, statins are a reasonable example, right? You come in with a little bit elevated cholesterol, maybe your doctor tells you, diet and exercise the first time, you come back 6 months or a year later, it's still up, you'll get put on a statin, right? And a lot of times it's risk-benefit, right? If the side effect profile is very low, then that may make sense. But I think ultimately it's providing prescribers and payers the tools to differentiate broad patient populations is really the way to address that, because and they have to be very inexpensive and, to your point, and readily accessible in order to be able to stratify those patients and identify the highest risk folks. When you can do that, then I think everybody wins. The patient wins, and the payer wins.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, thank you very much. Safia.
Hi, my name is not Mark, but I do have a weird accent, so you have to put up with that. So I think as Mark has mentioned that my background started from being a scientist and a drug discovery scientist, and now I've come down to the commercialization of this. So I introduce myself usually as a fully integrated drug dealer. I know we have really interesting topics today. I'm going to just talk briefly about transparency and patient engagement and then focus on innovation, especially in Indian context. And then if you could warn me 3 minutes before my time is up, I will give a little bit about the Rediscovery life science. All right. So transparency is the first topic. I mean, transparency, by definition, is a good thing. And what it does is it enables the world to see what they would otherwise not see. So that actually governs people's action. if you do something that you know no one is seeing, you might act in a path A, but if you know that it will be apparent, then you would be conscious. In an ideal world, integrity, people with high integrity would do the right thing regardless of who's seeing and who's not seeing. But we are human beings, and organizations are an accumulation of human beings. So the transparency about the information that exists, whether it is financial information or science information or clinical trial information, all of that is very critical. And for the health of an organization, for the investor value, it is also very critical, because today we are living in a world where information, something that happens in China doesn't stay in China, and it impacts the stock price globally. So the transparency of data also has another impact, especially the scientific data. If you are an academic researcher and you read the data of 3 companies in a particular disease, they all are looking at their data, but if you have the ability to integrate that data, you might be able to come up with an advancement of science, an advancement of medicine. So that transparency is great. In terms of patient engagement, I think my fellow panelists have covered a lot of ground. Of course, commercial organizations have been working towards including patients in their planning for some time. However, the new thing that is, which Jeff mentioned, is that now organizations, pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies are actually engaging patients early on, in fact, even at the discovery stage, to make sure that you have their perspective. And there are 2 benefits. When I worked for UCB Pharmaceuticals in Belgium, every year UCB has a conference, a leadership conference, where the top 100 people of the company get together once a year and exchange on strategy and everything. Invariably, every year, that begins with patient speech. Because what it does to a human being is, when we all have a desire to make money, we all have a desire to become rich or famous or be great, but we all also have a desire to be able to make a difference. And when you feel a real life patient in front of you describing their condition and impact of a good solution, it motivates you. It makes your work meaningful. It makes you want to come to work every day. And so that excitement in senior leadership is very valuable. So that patient engagement was very important. And I think this is very critical, that designing, or first of all, discovering a drug, focusing on which disease to go after, what kind of molecule to go after, what endpoints to focus on, because regulators' endpoints are, as you said, is a composite of some scores, sometimes some biomarkers. Well, if I am an arthritis patient, among all other symptoms and biomarkers, I'm also concerned about how my hands look. And I'm also concerned about the injection of a monoclonal antibody that I'm giving to myself, whether or not I'm going to press that injection into me. So those are the kind of things which allow companies to refine their products and really better meet the needs. So that's a great thing. Coming to innovation, this is one of the most used and abused words. I mean, anything that when you don't have something to say, or when you can't come up with a word for creativity, for something great, put the word innovation. And it fits. It fits pretty much every situation. Innovation, I looked at the meaning, it was a new idea, a new product, or introducing something new. The word has its roots in Latin and from 15th century. We have been using it for all our purposes in different ways, but in pharma or biotech industry, initially it was used as new drug or new device, a breakthrough in solving a problem. Over the years, that has changed. Now, innovation is a new financing model. How do you finance the development of a drug? Or a new number of innovations now are really using the previous innovations and integrating them together to make sure that you address the need better. And especially with the new methods of communications, the internet, the social media, the texting, and all of that, that allows company to come up with various platforms, and they are all innovation. Everyone has their own definition of innovation. For me, as long as something or some program or some project we do addresses a need, whether that need is articulated by the patient or whether it is unarticulated and you see it or you experience it, and make sure that you address the need before they even verbalize it, before they even recognize it. As long as it is useful, then fine, we can call it innovation. Well, and the question that Mark posed, and I will pose again, is that buying a drug or licensing a drug for X amount, having this revenue of Y amount, and as soon as you get that, jacking up the price 5,000 times, is that innovation? And frankly, I have met several people, several young people, your generation, who have repeatedly given me example of they are impressed by people who are doing this. Oh, these are actual guys. He came up, he bought it for $5 million from GSK, and now, without any changes, the stock value or market cap is over $1 billion. This is a genius guy. I want to do that too. This is a lot. At least in the younger generation, I'm noticing that there's a lot of motivation towards that, and that is perceived as innovation. And my question to all of you is, I want to know how you think about that we will discuss. I will move on to tell you what I'm doing now. I have worked in various large pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies. Right now, I have started my own company that's called Rediscovery Life Science. The idea is actually very simple. The idea is drugs that have been approved for indication A or in a country X, but not in Y, Z, and Z, to be able to develop those drugs because these drugs have already been used for indication A, so their safety profile is already established. So you cut time in development of it, and you cut a little bit of risk as well at the same time. But as long as these drugs are addressing a need, my lead asset is in acute kidney injury. Currently, there is no real pharmacological intervention for acute kidney injury. Dialysis or kidney transplants are the solutions that how you manage the patients with chronic kidney injury, but there's no drug which can actually either stop or reverse that injury. And I'm developing a drug right now that is going to, hopefully, post-clinical trial, be able to address that. So that, for me, is it an innovation? I don't care whether it's called innovation or not, as long as it addresses the need. The fact is that if I'm a kidney patient and I have to go to dialysis 3 times a week and my life has been limited, I'm happy to take a pill. I'm happy to take an injection which makes me live a much more normal life. And at the same time, right now the Medicare spends about 27% of their entire budget on dialysis patients because it's a very expensive proposition. So if you're able to take those patients off dialysis, it saves healthcare system as well. So the goal here is to make sure that the patients are served for their need, and also the healthcare system is, because if we keep pushing and putting the burden on the healthcare system, it's going to crack. And I will give the India thing because I have worked in India for 4 years. Their innovation definition is very, very different because necessity is the mother of invention. The necessities in India are very different from what necessities in America are. If I am a farmer in a village and my child has epilepsy, first of all, I wouldn't even call it epilepsy because everybody in my village thinks that this child has been cursed or must have committed some sin in their previous life, and that's why they're getting retribution for it. So I have to overcome that part there, and then I want to take to the neurologist. I will have to take, first of all, the cost of travel. Second, the time that I will be away because I'm a daily wage worker, and I can't afford to not earn money that day because that puts the food on the table. So while at UCB we had developed a program, we call it Hope on Wheels, which was a mobile epilepsy clinic. And it's not innovation per se, because the satellite and internet technology is not something I invented, though I would like to say that. So we had this van which was equipped like a small clinic, but also on top of that, it had the connection to the city through internet with a video camera and video conferencing ability and ability to see the data. So when this was going from village to village to village, a social worker went ahead of time to make sure that there's buy-in by the village elders, because they don't see it as, it is difficult for that stigma that epilepsy has. Then patients, when they would come, first of all, the family doesn't have to take time away. Two, when the patient comes through video conference, the junior doctor in the clinic connects to the top neurologist in Mumbai or Delhi or Bangalore. And so this neurologist, who really has a great practice, and there are always fewer neurologists than the country needs, and certainly the case in India. But this neurologist who really wants to help the patient, but he cannot leave his clinic and be gone for 3 days because there are his patients in the city also who suffer. Now he or she has the ability to serve these patients without having to leave his own. So we shifted the paradigm of patient going to the doctor. We are actually taking the doctor to the patient and taking it through technology. So I wouldn't call it, breakthrough innovation, but it is utilizing the innovations in various parts of the science and communication technology, but making it bringing it together to address. GE, for example, has done that in India. They have EEG machines, and they, in the United States, or developed one. You have clinics. All patients can come to those clinics and can be examined and tested. In India, when GE put a research lab there, they developed a small portable EEG machine. And why it is necessary in India? Because 700 million of Indians actually live in villages, in population which is far distant from the city. And these people are also below the poverty line. This is a 1.2 billion population country, which has tremendous amount of wealth and tremendous creativity. Now, to use that, EEG technology was already developed, but miniaturizing it, making it portable, enable doctors and healthcare professionals to really reach and service patients anywhere they need it to. Now, it started out in India, but it helps everywhere else. So.
I call it innovation.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Questions?
Yes.
I really love it. Thank you so very much for that presentation. And again, I really like what your new company is doing with basically using current characterized drugs in new diseases and potential new countries. That leads me into the idea of the communications sector in pharmaceuticals companies' role in that area. We talk about values, but values range drastically from different individuals to different cultures as well. And then we always use in communications like choice buzzwords or value propositions or innovative new ways of thinking about things to help decrease that gap. The unfortunate part is, at the end of it, science is hard, and it takes years and years to fully understand it ourselves in our careers, and then to distill it to the general public. But the general public only knows one or two things, but to fully understand the whole concept, and then we as scientists and clinicians throw a ton of words and statistics and probabilities, confusing even more the scenarios. And I see it all the time in marketing designs and trying to be able to really get at the root to make a patient understand, listen, you should stay away from the cheeseburger so you don't have to get laparoscopy later on. But you're right, necessity is the mother of all inventions, and these people won't move till the symptoms become so exacerbated where they're at the point of no return. So what do you think is then in the role of, I love how your company is taking that to reduce these and recapitulating this into other models. What about just general in the pharmaceutical field, and are there areas that at your guys' companies that actually do help communicate these transparencies or these value propositions?
I think you bring up a very important point. First of all, we are obligated by regulatory authorities to communicate all facts in a fair and balanced manner to anyone, including patients, because any misrepresentation of information will be penalized very, very severely. And oftentimes, it's not only the regulators that are keeping an eye on company X, but the competitor of the company X are also keeping an eye that the company is not claiming something which is not real. So it's in a way the peers are keeping everybody honest. So that part is really important, and that big transparency very important. Another part that I should have mentioned earlier is that while we are all happy about the internet and the information exchange and everything being available, you can Google pretty much anything and everything. There is a negative, which is, as of right now, it's not regulated. If I'm a patient and I go type this up the disease, I will see information. If I read that information and I just believe everything that I'm reading is correct, that's not true. So the ability to discern what is credible and what is non-credible information is very critical. And that's where the experts, either physicians or scientists, come in the picture. But if the scientists and people who have ability to decipher or discern that information are able to communicate in a public or in a manner, that would certainly serve public and the patients. So that's what I would say. But pharmaceutical company or biotech companies, they cannot misrepresent. There are certainly marketing tricks. And I would be the first one to admit that we do thrive on other people's misery. That's the reality of it. When people get sick, we make sales.
Lawyers.
Part of it is because we have to pay the lawyers. So yes, it is our responsibility, both social, moral, as well as legal.
Safia, thank you. I'm going to ask the team to sit up front here, to the panel, so we can address some more good questions. I know a couple of hands went up there, so why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I guess Safia's discussion kind of made me think of this, but I'm willing to hear other thoughts. So he said, I agree with you that innovation is creating a new product or creating new use for a product and not what other people might think is innovation. But those people do exist within the industry, within the environment, I guess. How do you deal with those people who think that innovation is just buying something and then jacking up the price? And how do you explain this also to friends who try to use that as an example of painting with a broad brush, and how do you kind of explain that that's not all that there is, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, you see an extreme example. It's the extreme example.
Mm-hmm.
It's appalling. I think 99.9% of people in our industry are so turned off by that, it's not even fun. So don't make that the standard. But the other thing is, and I've tried to really point some of those things out with what I'm doing there, is that the only way you can be successful in the long run is by doing things, whether it's developing services or devices, or in our case, drugs for rare diseases. And I'm never defensive. I mean, we're not the tobacco industry. We're not whatever. We're not the insurance companies. Controversial point. But yeah, so we do things that really do make a difference, and I stand up, look people in the eye, and find the cool way that. He does.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. At the back.
My name is Jeff. I graduated this past May, and I work at Shire currently. And since we have people from ex-United States on the panel, I wanted to ask a question. There was interest. I've also studied in India, Brazil. I returned to India this past January because it was so much fun. There's an article in HBR that said newly minted MBAs should go to emerging markets as soon as possible. I talked to former colleagues at Phillips who said you should do that before you lose the ability to think a different way. we work within the boundaries of the United States. How much do you value getting outside the United States and working in an affiliate market?
I cannot tell you that how much it has added to me, to my personal as well as professional growth. I think the 4.5 years that I worked, 1 year I didn't live, but 3.5 years I lived in India, but I ran the company for 4.5 years. And I think understanding that market, dealing with day-to-day issues that come up with that market, in fact, even understanding the culture, work culture in that market, branded generics, which we don't have in the US and as well as in Europe, competing in those markets really sharpens your skill. You know, when I'm marketing a drug in the US, I look for 4 years, 5 years before it loses patent, I start worrying about it and I start planning the lifetime extension strategy. Well, in India, I launched my brand and 13 generics are already present in the market. So in order for me to convert the doctors who are writing generic brand, because every generic has a brand name, convert them to my product, that would force me to become creative. That would push me to become creative and understand. So I highly recommend people to really go outside, because taking risk has its dangers, but its rewards.
And I would also add to that, having worked on 3 continents and run companies in 3 continents, that the greatest learning experience I had was getting dumped into a totally different culture and having to very rapidly get on board and understand how different it was to the US. And those adaptations that you make, you take with you everywhere, and it serves you well. So every student here, I would say to you, get a chance to go and work abroad anywhere, take it, it's going to help you. And you've done that too, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
Far enough.
so.
One last question, because then we have to all go downstairs.
My question is around R&D productivity. So I think it was Mark who threw up that number of it cost $800 million. That number is going up, and it doesn't seem to be balanced out by like new molecular entities. So, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge that faces like pharma R&D, and what needs to change to sort of reverse that trend of like declining productivity?
Well, nutrition is huge. As you know, for every 10,000 molecules that are discovered in a lab, 1 will make it to market. So that attrition rate is huge. I think it's better candidate selection early on.
I mean, I think we, trying to reduce attrition through safety. I mean, but ultimately, it's kind of selecting the right biology. I would say it's understanding the disease well enough to be able to make sure you're in the right biology. Because if you're wrong, then there's really nothing else you'll do past that point that will be successful. So it's really kind of investing in basic science and leveraging the kind of the R&D ecosystem that exists across industry and biotech and academics.
And just to give you another statistic, Tufts actually published at the end of 2014 the average cost to develop a drug, which takes into account all the failures, and it's closer to $2.6 billion, $2.8 billion. So it's incredibly expensive. And that time window, I can tell you, in my lifetime with pharma has not changed that much. It's actually extended. And it's taking longer to get there. The clinical studies are incredibly expensive and very hard. So how do you change that if you want something that's absolutely safe? And the answer, I think, is coming out of the rare disease and coming out of the cancer fields where risk is being taken earlier. And that's something which we may see more of in the future as people start to ask, can I have that drug now? I'll take the risk. Not you, FDA, or not you, pharma company. So I think there's a movement afoot, and we'll see some change. How it's going to work, God knows yet, but it's going to change. Thank you all very much. Fabulous, did a fantastic job, I think.